Well, thank you all for joining me tonight. I've been to a lot of SBPMA meetings over the years, so it's a thrill for me to be up here giving a presentation. Our topic is business strategy for product managers. At first I thought I'd just start by telling you a little bit about myself. I've been doing product for about 10 years. Before that, I was a software engineer and architect. I like to begin with a definition of strategy. I think strategy is one of these words that people use a lot, like very imprecisely. People will talk about, oh, here's my product launch strategy, or here's my pricing strategy. And for a lot of those things, they're much more tactical. So Webster's defines strategy as a careful plan or method for achieving a particular goal, usually over a long period of time. I think the long period of time is important. Right? Your strategy is not something you're going to do for the next month or the next quarter. This is sort of fundamentally like how you're trying to make your business work. And so in a business context, the goal we're trying to get is sustainable competitive advantage. We want to be able to outcompete our competitors over the long run. So for my purposes, define strategy as a careful plan or method for achieving sustainable competitive advantage. So the next question is, why should we care about strategy? And I think there are a bunch of reasons for this. It helps you figure out if you can be successful entering a market. Even in nascent markets, you can use strategy principles to predict what the industry structure is going to look like down the road, and that gives you important information. Like if you're in a market that's likely to turn out to be winner take all, or maybe there's likely only be two players, it probably makes sense more to try to invest a lot up front to be one of those players. However, it's a market that looks like it's going to be fragmented and doesn't have any sort of strategic layout that makes it likely to have just one or two dominant players. That might not be just such a good strategy. I also think strategy effects are much more pronounced now than they used to be because of the internet. Like previously, geography would allow businesses to compete against each other, but now the effects of geography are weak. And I think competitive advantages last longer because innovation cycles are faster. So next, I'd like to talk about some strategy frameworks. And this first one here is really the classic strategy framework. If you take an academic class on business strategy, you will certainly run into this. And Porter here is Michael Porter. He's a professor at the Harvard Business School and probably the sort of biggest living authority on business strategy. And so Porter lays out these 5 forces that you can use to figure out like what the dynamics in the industry are. And so on the vertical axis, he's talking about what are your customers' other options. So at the top, he's saying threat of new entrants. So if you're in a business and you're the only one and you're making really good profits, right, it's likely other people are going to want to enter that business. So how likely is it that other people can enter that business? Now, if there are barriers to entry, things that make it really hard to enter, then this is much less of a threat. Now, on the bottom is threat of substitute products. And this is a kind of competition I don't think we tend to think a lot about, right? It's what is your customer's other options if they don't choose something in your category, like you or one of your direct competitors. And like one way to think about this, if there's like a really bad winter in Florida, like the oranges, their orange crop is wiped out. And so oranges get really expensive. And so when you go to the grocery store, you might say oranges are expensive, I'll buy an apple instead. It's not the same, but it fulfills the same purpose. And a lot of times there are substitutes that aren't as obvious. Like people think about, when we talk about Uber and Lyft, oh, it competes with taxis. Well, it also competes with rental cars. Right? Because people have it gives them the option when they go on a trip not to take Uber and Lyft rather than rent a car. And in some ways, it also, like Uber and Lyft also compete with parking. I read this article the other day talking about how parking vendors are seeing lower revenues because people are taking Uber and Lyft rather than driving their cars and parking. So these are all substitutes for those other businesses. Now on the vertical axis, this has to do with who can claim the value from your product or service. So what's the bargaining power of your customers? There's a lot of options in the market. Customers do have a lot of bargaining power. And this is like when we say bargaining power, we might think of people negotiating price. In consumer markets, people don't directly negotiate price, but they can choose lower cost options. Versus if there are very few people in that market, in your market, right, then you typically can charge high prices because of the lower bargaining power of your customer. Now, on the other end is bargaining power of suppliers. Right? If you have important inputs to your product or service that are not available from other vendors, right, your suppliers can claim a lot of your value. Like in software businesses, we don't tend to think a lot about this. It doesn't tend to be that much of a problem. So like in our SaaS world, a lot of our inputs are like servers or infrastructure as a service where there's a lot of competition. But if you're building something where there are critical components, it's like kind of the window shifts. You're their customer, and you don't have a lot of bargaining power, so they can kind of grab some of that value from you. Now, in the center is the competitive rivalry in the industry. This is how cutthroat your industry is. How much competition is there, and how aggressive is it with each other? Like, so a traditional example of this is the airline industry. They used to get into price wars with each other all the time. It was an extremely cutthroat industry. And they're actually really bad at making money because of this. Lately, they've merged into bigger players, and it's gotten much less cutthroat. Now, cutthroat industries are sort of well known to me since I work in ad tech, and this is the LUMAscape for ad tech. And ad tech is a industry that has a lot of competitive rivalry. This is an eye chart. It's hard to see the logos, but it's extremely competitive, and so it does hurt the profitability, like sort of expected profitability of the industry and actual profitability of the industry because it is so cutthroat. So Porter goes on to tell us that there are some generic strategies that are kind of the building blocks of what you can use for your business and your product. So down in the left corner there is cost leadership, right? And one important thing to note here is he says cost, not price, right? If your cost structure is the same as your competitors, you can't, it's not a sustainable competitive advantage to try to underprice them because they can just match your prices. And we'll look at an example a little later in the talk in detail about cost leadership. Now next to it's differentiation. I think this is the one that that is dear to the heart of product managers. Because what are we trying to do? We're trying to make our products better than the competition so that we can outcompete them. On the top, we've got segmentation strategy. And this is the cousin of differentiation. Segmentation says, I'm only going to go after a portion of the market. And because I'm not going after the whole market, I can tailor my product or service to serve that part of the market better. So be different and better. So now I'd like to move on to some key concepts around strategy. And if you remember one thing from what I tell you tonight, this is the most valuable one to remember. That the greatest threat to any strategy you come up with is that your competitors are just going to imitate it. And if they imitate it, they're doing the same thing as you, and you can't, if you're all doing the same thing, you don't get a competitive advantage. And Porter, again here, tells us something important. He says the essence of strategy is in the activities. Choosing to perform activities differently or perform different activities than rivals do. And so the only way to have an advantage over your competitors is to be different than them. And so if you have a great strategy, the only way to get them not to imitate you is either to do something they can't do, they're just not able to do it, or something that they won't do because it costs them in other areas. And that could be that, like, if they have a certain brand positioning now, and if they imitate your strategy, it would hurt other parts of their business to change their brand positioning. And when we look at cost leadership in detail, we'll see an example of what it means, like how business can have really different activities. So the second most important thing I'm going to tell you is this one. It's about trying to figure out how much value you're adding. And for this, I have to get a little bit formal about the terms for it to make sense. So I'm going to define value created from your product is the customer's willingness to pay. Not the actual price in the market, but what is the most they would pay for your product or services. So for most customers, they would pay a little bit more, or maybe a lot more than you're charging them if your service is valuable to them. we're going to subtract off the cost. And our intuitive thought about cost here is how much does it cost to produce the next unit or serve an additional customer. But for our purposes here, that's not how I want to define cost. It's not like the marginal cost of another unit. It is the total cost, including all your R&D, everything it takes to be in business. Like in the old days in software, we sell licensed software, and so the cost of like a marginal unit was nothing. But that wasn't, you weren't creating, like, it wasn't all value creation. You still had to have the staff of developers, you had to pay to build all this, you had to do all this marketing to get people to buy it. And even today, right, like SaaS software, like a healthy SaaS business, about 70% gross margin, but you still have to pay those developers and all those other things you want to be in business. And there's one other important bit here when it comes to cost. You have to pay for all your inputs, including your capital. Like your shareholders expect a certain return. And so when we think about how much value you create, we're thinking about how to create larger than average value, not just like what everyone in the business gets who does like a halfway competent job. So when we take that willingness to pay, subtract off the cost of everything that goes into the business, that's the value created for each customer you have. Now, added value is the amount of value that would disappear if your product and service were no longer there, right? So your customers all had to do something else. You can almost think about it as like your product and service never existed. Like how much would the value created for an individual customer go down? And then we sum that up across all of your customers. And like I think this part is the intuitive part, right? If your product is exactly the same as your competitor's product, your cost structure is the same, and you disappear, then their value, everybody's value created in their transactions is the same, and you have no added value. And this relates to that point that Porter was telling us about unique activities. You have to be different to generate added value. And the reason I think added value is so important is this is the upper bound on your superior above average returns. You have to get above average return from your business. You have to create additional unique value and then figure out how to capture this. And so I think it's a little bit of a complicated topic, so I like to work through an example. So I've got my iPhone here, and I paid $850 for this iPhone. It's not an iPhone 10, so it's, it wasn't $1,200. And so say the maximum I would pay for this iPhone is $900. I'm going to say the cost of producing the iPhone is $275. I took this from some iSupply numbers, and like Tim Cook is well known to say those numbers are all wrong. But I think for all purposes, they're close enough because they illustrate the point, even if they're off by a little bit. So if I subtract that, the maximum I would pay, the $275, the value created when you find that iPhone, $625. That's a lot for a product that sells for $850. But it doesn't explain yet why Apple is the most valuable company in the world. But if we look at what the added value is here, so if there are no iPhones, I would have to buy an Android phone. I know a lot of you probably like Android phones. I don't like them as much as my iPhone. So I wouldn't pay as much for one of them. And I probably wouldn't buy a flagship phone. I'm like, oh, these Android phones are all the same. I don't care that much, so maybe I'd buy this like OnePlus that's out there. Maybe I'd say I'd pay $560 for it. And we're saying it uses components that aren't quite as expensive, so we'll say it costs $230. So the value created is $330. My version of the slide I've got here is like my notes version. Oops, I had it wrong. So the added value is $295. I originally said $300. Copied the wrong version of the file. So that amount, that $295, is a huge amount of added value on something that is $850. And this explains why Apple is the most valuable company in the world, because they have so much added value. That's why they're able to generate these amazing returns. So they earn 91% of all profits in the cell phone industry. And this is possible because of the high added value. They're doing something unique that people are willing to pay more for than the other option, and they're also able to capture a large portion So now I want to move on and look at some sources of competitive advantage. And we'll start with the cost advantage. This was one of Porter's generic strategies. And so for cost advantage, I want to look at Southwest Airlines. And so when I went to business school, I must have had like 10 case studies on Southwest Airlines. And business school professors love Southwest Airlines because it's a great example of how doing unique activities allows you to provide, gives you a competitive advantage. So Southwest does a lot of things that are different than their competitors. And especially if we think back to when Southwest was founded. And you've got these incumbent carriers. So Southwest flies all 737s. And this saves them money because they don't have to have parts for different airplanes. All their pilots, they don't have to train their pilots on different airplanes. They do the fastest turnarounds in the industry. So they have the planes are on the ground in this amount of time. And airplanes only make money when they're in the sky. Like we don't pay the airline to have us sit on the tarmac. Like we pay them to take us places.
It feels like it sometimes these days.
And so you make more money because you can do more trips, get more tickets if you turn around your planes really fast. And this is, even though the Southwest has been doing this for a long time, this is well known, they turn around planes faster than everyone else. Nobody else would be able to catch up to that. They tend to fly to smaller airports. This one, they've moved to some bigger airports over time, but still a lot of their routes are to smaller airports. And this is actually part of the reason they can turn around faster, because those airports are less congested. They don't do any seat assignments. Other airlines are now like charging for seat assignments. Southwest doesn't have any. They have no first class. They do point-to-point service rather than hub and spoke. There's no baggage or change fees. And so when we were talking earlier about doing unique activities, right? Those incumbent carriers, they don't want to do things like Southwest and do like get rid of seat assignments because they're like, we make money on this. But these things work together for Southwest to give them the system where they can be really efficient on the cost side. And so I've got some data here from 2016's Southwest data. And when we look at airlines, one way to think about them is to look at their numbers per passenger mile. So that's the number of miles our airplanes fly times the number of seats on that airplane. And it's a good way to normalize, or like compare different airlines on a like basis. And so these numbers probably aren't very meaningful until we compare them to some other airlines. Right? These are the incumbent carriers. And we'll notice something if we look here. Southwest has by far the lowest cost per mile of any of these incumbent airlines. And that is because they do all these unique activities. Delta is actually doing well on the margin. It's a little bit ahead of Southwest. But the other point I want to make here is that, like, even though these guys can't or won't do the things that Southwest did to get this advantage. I mean, United actually tried for a while. A while back, they had this airline called TED, which was like, they tried to like pick a bunch of things from Southwest and match them. They weren't. It wasn't very successful. And part of the reason for that is like Southwest unique activities kind of all work together, like to give them these advantages. And so TED probably picked like some of them that maybe were just sort of quirky, like, oh, Southwest employees can wear shorts, or TED employees can wear shorts. But they didn't do other ones, like, because like United's hub is SFO, and they're doing a lot of flights out of SFO, and SFO is like not a good place to turn around planes fast, and has a lot of delays. But the other thing when we think about strategy, right, is that there's always imitations. So even though these guys couldn't do it, wouldn't do it, right, you get somebody who comes along and picks up a lot, some of the Southwest's unique activities, right? JetBlue flies all A320s. And they use some of these activities to get a lower cost per mile from Southwest. And their margin per mile is about the same. Now, they're not as big, so they don't make as much money, but I think one of the important points here is that people will always try to imitate you, right? So the imitation is always a threat to any strategy. But this example also nicely shows how unique operations really do make a difference. And the other thing to think about with Southwest is that anytime you have a cost leadership position, you have two options, right? You can either lower your prices and take share, or just make above average margins. There's like two ends of the spectrum. Typically, you'll set it somewhere in the middle, and that decision will be different for every business. Now, there's other good examples out there about cost leadership. And like Walmart's a very classic example. They're very good at supplier bargaining. They have the best distribution network. So they were the brick and mortar version, kind of be like a super efficient retailer that other people can't match. Amazon, again, like, it's got their own circle. So this is my notes version, but you get the point. Like they've done the online version of this. And like Dell's also very interesting. It's kind of more historical example. It goes back to the days where we bought desktop computers instead of laptops. And so the traditional way that you do computer sales, right, desktop computers, you manufacture them, you put them in boxes, you ship them to retailers, right, and then hope people buy them. Now Dell did something very different. They did all direct sales, and they did not assemble your computer until you ordered it. So they basically had like zero finished product inventory, because the day that they go assemble your computer, it gets put on a UPS truck and shipped to you. And they also required their suppliers to basically keep their inventory right next to their assembly facility. So Dell didn't even take possession of it until that computer was ordered, right? And so they've got such low inventory, and this lowers their costs, and gave them a unique advantage. So the next source of competitive advantage I want to talk about is the network effect. Or one way I like to think about this is, why doesn't Facebook have any successful competition? And so when we look at the definition of a network effect, it's the value of a product or service is increased by others using it. Now, a lot of products don't fall into this category, right? Like, so you've got this refrigerator at home. Your refrigerator's utility to you doesn't change based on what your refrigerator brand your neighbor has. It just doesn't matter to you. This is generally true of cars too, right? Like, your car is not have more utility to you if a lot of other people drive that car, or not.
One exception is when you go look for spare parts in a junkyard.
Well, yeah.
If you have an unusual car, you'll have a hard time.
That's true. And if you have a really high volume car, often there's a lot of aftermarket parts too that are cheaper. And so there's some mild effects, but actually most people don't even consider this when they buy cars. So it's pretty mild there. But there are other businesses where the network effect is really predominant. It shapes the whole structure of this industry, right? So for all of social networks, this is true, right? So what's the value of a social network where none of your friends are on it?
Peace of mind.
I might call it anti-social network at that point. So you can't leave Facebook because your friend, if you went someplace else, your friends aren't there, and it's not useful to you. And this is true of LinkedIn, right? The context is different, it's professional context. But again, if you've got no contacts there, what's the point of it? This also tends to be true for two-sided marketplaces. So places like eBay, right? If I want to sell something, I've got a bunch of junk in my closet I really should sell off, right? I want to go sell on eBay because the buyers are there. And if I want to buy something, people go to eBay because the sellers are there. And so it creates this very, very sticky market. And so this is why eBay is basically took over the entire auction market for goods. Airbnb is another example. You want to rent a place to stay, it's on Airbnb. And if you want to rent out your third bedroom or your vacation home, you want to go where the people are looking for. It's also true of Craigslist. It also tends to be very true of software as well. And that's because, for any operating system, right, the real value of it is the applications on it. And when developers build applications for platforms that have a lot of users. And so Windows, it's not something we tend to think about that much now, but it's still a huge business for Microsoft. And why do people use it? Because applications. Craigslist is an example I like to dive into, right? We're all product managers. How many ways can you come up with to improve Craigslist? I bet we all come up with 10 in under a minute.
Yep.
And it's hardly changed in 10 years, right? 1999 called and wants its website. And so the question is, like, how does this thing still be the dominant force for, like, classified listings, right? It's not that other people haven't tried to compete. Like, Facebook with their massive user base is doing this marketplace thing, and a lot of other classified startups. But this is network effect, right? You don't get any successful competition because sellers go there because the buyers are there, and buyers go there because the sellers are there. And to make matters worse, for a lot of the competition, you can't undercut them on price because most of the listings are free. So we end up with this odd situation. We're stuck with this thing that could be a lot better, but there's no innovation because like its network effect drives more value than whatever improvements like all the smartest product people in the world could come up with to improve this website.
Well, that's why actually the part that's really funny about it is go back to the slide. Take a look at the list of things. Every single one of those items, there's probably a startup who has innovated, but only on that slice, right? Personals. How many, whether it's the Tinders or the Match.coms or whatever, whether it's things related to selling, so maybe it's eBay, maybe it's some of the newer mobile apps, housing, Zillow, apartment rent, all these things. Like,
And yet Craigslist
it still goes.
It still goes. And like if you want to sell off some random thing you have in your closet, right? It's like you could eBay it if you want to sell it someplace totally far away. If you want to sell it someplace close, this is where you go.
So, can I?
Sure.
So this is just an opinion. So for Craigslist, does the value lie improving it or not improving it according to you?
Well, the value lies in its network that everyone goes
That's
with.
completely fine. That's a network effect. But what I'm saying is, if we try to, basically there was a reason why we thought of having a Craigslist. But does the value still continue to in improvement or not in improvement? Because in my opinion, the value still continues if you don't improve.
Yeah, because the predominant value is because of the network. I think the overall value would be higher if it were better. You could find more things you were looking for and buy more stuff there.
And that's where we go back to what the purpose was.
If they went to improve it, to do all the things that we associate with modern, web, mobile application, there's a whole bunch of stuff they would have. Like, I actually know Craig personally, and the team of people that he has on this is like minuscule, right? It's ridiculous. To actually do any of the improvements that we might think about, it would cost a bunch of money. So to your cost structure point, you'd have to undercut one of its other values, which is, like you said, most of this is free.
That's a good point, right? So yeah, I hadn't thought about that before. Right, he's driving a big cost advantage by having a very basic website, which is also making it hard for people to compete. So yeah.
It goes back to the company objective too, right? They are not company for profit to begin with. So they don't need to make improvement until they need to. And whether it will help or not, the real product management answer is you wouldn't know until you try. You have to experiment, you have to do some testing.
That's very debatable.
Actually, like it's not the most modern UIs, but actually there's something very simple. And I think there's a lot for it.
Yeah.
Retro.
Yeah, I think there's a good point there that there is some utility for being straightforward. But I know when I'm trying to search for very specific things here, I'm just like, pull your hair out because it's just most things have no attributes. If you're searching for some piece of furniture, you end up looking at like hundreds of different things that you're not interested in. That any like decent search UI would allow you to filter out, but none of that's out.
But you would be surprised. So I have a buddy who worked with a thing called Rethink up in Vancouver. And they were the original domainiers. So these were people who bought hockey.com, right? And I asked my buddy, why does this business work? He says, at least at the time, before you had Chrome where you would search as well as the location bar, most people, he said, were basically button mashers. I'm looking for a used car. I would enter used car in the location bar. It wouldn't go to Google search. That didn't exist yet. And the browser would go, what the hell is this? Okay, I'll eliminate the space. I don't know, I'll put a .com at the end. Is there a server there? Yeah, there is. Here you go. And his company would have usedcar.com and essentially serve localized placements and ads. And so even though it sucks from our perspective, for a lot of people, it's like, I entered used car and it took me someplace that I could buy a used car. success. Maybe it's the same thing.
Yeah. So, so Uber is a two-sided marketplace too. There's riders and drivers. So what do people think about how strong the network effect is on Uber?
I wouldn't think quite that strong, because as soon as Diff comes up with a better marketing strategy, people won't do it.
Right, and so I think that's correct. There's low lock-in, but like eBay and Craigslist have really low lock-in too. So one of my arguments about why I think the market, like network effect's a little less valuable here, is because the advantages of the network effect that you see on eBay, like I have two advantages as a big network as a seller, right? My thing might sell faster, but my bigger advantages are more buyers, like can charge higher prices. And that doesn't exist on Uber. Like the advantage to the driver, because Uber sets the prices, that the advantage to the driver is just that they get more rides, right? Or they spend less time idle. And so I think that lowers their network effect, is less advantageous to the driver.
It's a managed marketplace as opposed to like eBay.
Yeah.
It's a direct contact between buyers and sellers. People are paying each other directly without eBay. eBay is just providing the platform. Uber is actually managing the marketplace. So
Uber is
they
the beers.
are like pseudo employees of Uber, right? The drivers. They are not employees, but they're as good as employee or independent contractors.
Well, yeah, and so quite from a legal argument, like if Uber allowed drivers to set their own prices, it'd probably be much harder to challenge them in court and say they're employees. It'd be like, how can they be employees? They decide what they charge.
That's right.
And the other is selling a product that has a specific life cycle of the idea of the transaction. The buyer wants something now, generally immediately. And if Uber doesn't have it because the next year Uber driver is 4 minutes away,
Yeah.
and Lyft has it because it's 3 minutes away, you're going to take Lyft if you're in a hurry. So the idea is that time between the actual time you actually buy and the time you actually get the delivery matters. And so unless Uber has a way of making sure there are plenty of drivers every place, not only for cost to enough drivers if they want to do it at some point, you turn back around and say, okay, Uber's got the bigger overall network.
The other thing is it's a commodity.
Yeah.
It doesn't really, one driver is the same as another driver as far as the ride is concerned. They're not marketing limousines versus, smart cars or whatever.
The other part that might have diluted as well is like Uber was ahead, but it wasn't like miles ahead, right? Like Facebook was like miles ahead in terms of the growth of its network. There were predecessors, but its growth outpaced all of them. In the case of Uber, like, yeah, it wasn't like Uber was the out-and-out winner. There was Uber and Lyft, and the relative cost to a person to install both apps is like approaching zero, right? It's mostly effort and time. And so maybe that weakened it as well because it wasn't there wasn't the lock-in into the network. I had options.
I think that's a good point, but like we think back to like when eBay, like Amazon made this huge run like, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago to compete with them on auctions. And like running an auction site is not very hard. You could like any developer probably build one on the weekend. I mean, running at scale is hard, but just building one, right? It's not that hard. So like I actually think one of the things that because of this, there's no pricing advantage to drivers. Like loyalty is pretty low. I mean, historically they kind of annoyed the drivers. Like they did things like not put tipping in the app for a long time. It's easy to
How many drivers do you see having both stickers on their car?
you see a lot. They actually, okay, this like I'm missing this one here, but so they actually did something that's really interesting. Is that they pay a lot of bonuses to drivers now based on how many rides they do. Both Lyft and Uber are doing this, right? And I think like not that wages or earnings on Uber are high for drivers, but I think Uber would prefer not to pay those bonuses. But because network effect's not as strong, they end up doing it, right? Because we think back to like Porter's 5 Forces, where it's the suppliers have some bargaining power here because they can go choose another platform to be on. And so Uber and Lyft have had to try to like keep their drivers captive by saying, well, if you do this many rides a day or a week, you get 1 month. So just splitting between them for which one's right better at this moment doesn't pay off for you.
And engaging into some nefarious practices in order to
had to go
traffic
special.
Yeah.
providers into driving.
If market share tends to flip in favor of one, I think what's happening is they tend to stabilize. So one, as one gets more market share, you can subsidize to get more providers and drivers on the platform to pull it back. But if one kind of skews like way ahead, I think you'll probably see the other collapse pretty quick.
It could be. I mean, I kind of think it's going to be like kind of like Coke and Pepsi setup, right? This is a market like it's not like Facebook, like personal social networking, where like it's like there's just one, right? So you probably get one big one and one smaller one because the industry structure result is network effects not strong enough to eliminate all the competition. So when we have a network effect, we tend to get this winner take all, or the majority of the value. And so it's something that you really want to think about when you're approaching a market, especially in the early stage of it. I think it tells us something really interesting too. This is why you get nonlinear outcomes for consumer businesses, right? The top guy in a space might get acquired at a very high value per user, and number two is not anywhere near that. And it's because these markets have network effects, being that number one position is so valuable.
But there are opportunities within that situation to have some sort of segmentation strategy, to have some added value or differentiation.
Yeah, so if you can segment off the part of the market and serve them better, right? And we can sort of think about, like Brendan's point earlier about there are these sort of vertical things to Craigslist that have survived. Like you can't like compete against Craigslist across the broad swath of that market. But yeah, you can segmenting it off is a good strategy in trying to serve that. So the final source of competitive advantage I want to talk about is differentiation. And so this is the one that as product managers, I think we like the best, it's the one we gravitate to, we spend all our time, like how do we make our product or service better, so that's how, and get an advantage over our competition. And so the question is, can you get a sustainable competitive advantage out of this? Like the short run you can. You put in something into your product that's really great, people like it, it increases adoption of your product, but then your competitors can just copy this, right? And like a good current example of this is Snapchat was very popular. It had these stories, they were only there for 24 hours, particularly popular with younger demographic. But what did Facebook do? They said, okay, people like this, we'll just put it in all our platforms, and it's allowing them to take share from Snap. And so just having that stories feature wasn't sustainable as a competitive advantage because competitors just imitated it. So I think the question then comes to, can competitor copy what you've done? And so I want to look at some examples where people I think actually did build a better product and won with it over the long haul. And my favorite example here is Google Web Search. And it's because of everything we've talked about tonight and everything else I know is strategy is not in this presentation. There's no reason to think that the web search market should be dominated by one player, right? There's no network effect. Some people might argue, well, they get more data and helps them with the algorithm, but I think that's pretty mild, right? Like, I don't really care what web search engine like any of you use. It doesn't change my utility of it, like it would on LinkedIn or Facebook. And if we think back to the early days of the internet, there was a lot of competition. There were a lot of search engines out there. I actually worked for one of them called Inktomi. It was there around much before Google. So Google was the late entrant, and they came in and were able to, and why were they successful? They were able to have better results. And so the thing about this market, right, is there's no switching costs. Like, literally, if I want to use Bing, right, I just type Bing into my browser. It's actually 2 less characters, right? There's nothing sticky here. And it's not, even after that early phase of competition, right, Microsoft spent a ton to compete with Google. They made such a big effort at it. Because I worked with Inktomi, I didn't even work in web search, but when Microsoft was staffing up that Bing team, I just had these recruiters calling me constantly, because they were trying to find anyone who knew anything about search, and the recruiters were like, oh, you should apply, they're paying huge salaries, like they really were not sparing an expense. But somehow Google has maintained the best results. And that's actually, like, we take it for granted today. We tend to think, oh yeah, Google's the best search engine, that's just the way it is. But if you step back and think about it, there's not a good reason for this. Or like, not like a sort of marketplace dynamic reason for this, right? So Google has been able to stay better than the competition. I mean, I might offer it, just like maybe it just turns out to be a really hard problem. But it's a really interesting example of this. Another one I like to look at is Netflix. And they came to be the biggest player in the streaming market. And I want to look at this historically, because this market has changed from just kind of being like how you function as a service to having original content. So it's quite a different market than when they started streaming in 2007. Right? Like once everyone started doing original content, Netflix started this in 2013. But so the question is, why do they end up dominating the streaming market? Right? And so there are all these pay TV vendors, right, who knew Netflix was their competitor. But I would argue that Netflix, thinking back to that era, right, it had the best experience streaming. Like if you use anything like a cable company or satellite company, its UI was always awful. And Netflix did a couple other things that were really interesting. They went for really wide distribution, right? Rather than saying, oh, you Mr. Device Manufacturer, you should pay a lot of money to have Netflix on your device. They made it available to get their distribution out, but they did a really good job of maintaining like UX consistency across all those different devices. And the other little bit about them is that compared to these pay TV vendors, they were radically higher value. But Amazon came along and bundled streaming with Prime, so a lot of people were getting it for free. And so one of the major reasons they were able to get their position like in that era before original content is they really did have a nicer to use product. So my third example here is Dropbox. And this is also a really interesting example because if you go back and look at the history of this consumer cloud storage market, there were a lot of players in it, right? Look at all those logos up there. Like almost none of them look familiar. There's only one that's kind of still around today, and that's Box, and they essentially left the consumer market. Right? They said this isn't working for us. We're going to go to the enterprise market. The other one I recognize up there is XDrive. That's because I was working at AOL when AOL acquired XDrive, and working at integrating XDrive with some AOL products. But probably many of you remember it because it's all faded away. And there were so many of them because there were low barriers to entry, right? It wasn't hard to start a storage service, right? You buy some servers, some disk drive, you build a client, and like there, you're in this business. And so Dropbox comes along and they were kind of like Google, right? They were a late entrant to the market, but they turned out to be hugely successful, right? To the point that like the only other offerings in this market today are done by these really large, like Google Drive or Microsoft, who essentially bundle with the rest of their services, right? They're like really the kind of only pure play we can think of. So why were they successful? They did a great job integrating into the operating system, right? It just worked. It was simple. Like I remember XDrive well because I had worked with it. It was more complicated. It acted like it was like a separate drive, and you had to mount it. And like Dropbox made it very, 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 very smooth, nice integration to OS. And another smart thing they did was viral growth through referral storage bonuses, right? So if you referred your friend, you both got more storage. But like that's totally imitatable. Everyone else in the market could have done that too. And so I really like Dropbox's founder, Drew Houston's slide deck on lessons learned from this. It's fantastic. I really recommend that you go take a look at it. And the takeaway from it is that he says building a bulletproof, scalable, cross-platform storage architecture is hard, right? And I think that kind of relates to the Google example too, that if building something at a radically higher quality is difficult, that gives you an opportunity to be unique.
actually wonder in the end, has Dropbox been, quote, successful? Like, I'm trying to read, they didn't make it across the line with an IPO, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But like, it was at a reduced valuation.
Compared to what they had been, right? So you're talking about this multi-billion-dollar valuation.
Well, yeah.
They are not, I don't think they were able to scale. They gained a lot of momentum to begin with, had a pretty good brand both. But compared to Box, who pivoted to support the enterprise customers.
And even Box, back to the strategy thing, like, how many different drive storage, online storage things do you have right now available to you? Like, okay, if you're using any Microsoft device, you've got SkyDrive. If you're a Google Apps, you've got, Google Drive. Your company might use Box, but the companies I've been in, we transitioned from Box to Google Drive because it was good enough. iCloud, I mean, what is it that Dropbox actually can do today, now, better than anyone else to maintain that versus not only storage, but also, creative, collaborative tools for editing documents and all those kinds of other things.
I think initially it was all about the cross-device access, right?
Yeah, cross-device access is really powerful, it worked really smoothly.
I think sync was another big thing that you could sync really, really well, or dynamically work across, like Google offers with Docs.
And that's why I say, like, I'm still not even convinced about Box, because ultimately, what do I actually care about as a customer? Do I care about syncing files, or do I care about working collaboratively with my peers from anywhere on any device? And the pieces that are missing from a storage player are the collaborative editable tools, which are dominated by Microsoft Office 365 first, and then maybe Google.
Yeah, that's the more business to enterprise end of the market, right? Like, they really care about that stuff. And I think there's probably overall more money there, just there's higher willingness to pay for businesses for that kind of stuff. But, right, we did have a situation with this zillion consumer storage companies, and really the only one that survives, and it's still, worth billions of dollars, is Dropbox, right? So the question is, how did they do that?
That's very interesting, because I think storage, goes back to PubMatic and all like a Seagate, and storage becomes commodity very fast. And they may be feeling the same pain, because the real value is in software, which is, like you said, is a different set of companies offering that, and not the guys that you had in that circle.
Yeah, and so I think the real pain they feel today, I think both in their consumer offering and an enterprise offering, is that everyone else, like the players left are the big ones who are bundling. Apple, Google, Microsoft. And I think that's a problem both like for Dropbox in the enterprise segment and for Box, is that like often like if your company is using like Gmail or Office 365, like you're getting this stuff for free, and is the other things like really compelling enough to pay for it that it does this basic functionality.
Actually, Dropbox, I think, has had a network effect that's allowed them to stay on, because a lot of people I know were sharing stuff using Dropbox. That content is still on Dropbox. So that's the thing, that's the persistent part, and as long as that's persistent and people care about that content, Dropbox has a future.
No, that's a great point. Where they failed is they were hoping that sales groups they were sharing the Dropbox files would start paying. And that didn't happen. The minute the email came to pay, that went nowhere, because finance like, wait, this is not approved.
Right, because there are other places to spend money on, and that would actually, rather than spending money on OneDrive, thank you very much.
Yeah, exactly.
Only 4% of Dropbox total users were paying customers.
Right.
200 million users, only 4% were paying.
I can still store all my files, I can store all my photos, I can store all my photos if I want to on Google Drive, but I think I can store them all on Sharpie for free.
Yeah, it's just storage is a tough market in that regard.
Yeah.
And I think not only Dropbox, but overall, it seems like the Dropbox policy, and I'm not speaking for or against, or just an opinion, is a strategic directive of picking. It seems to be like it's more an open system kind of model or framework. Even though with time, we started as the intended purpose was actually for something else. It was trying to get to a more closed system, but it opened
challenges with anything like Dropbox is the idea of when do I think of accessing or using it? It's like a typical tool, it's when I need it.
Yeah.
But the idea of I've got a toolbox, and I only go to my toolbox when I'm needing my toolbox, at some point I don't remember, do I actually have a hammer? Do I care about having a hammer? And so the only time I actually go to the toolbox is when I use the hammer. Well, with Dropbox, it's the same kind of thing. I use it when I need it. And if I'm using it regularly because I'm sharing content, is one thing. But if I stop sharing content for a while, if people aren't sharing with me, I forget that I have it. And yeah, I think there's an idea of this feature set, which is a strategic feature to think about, which is if your product is a tool and people only using it a certain amount of time, what's the feature that would allow them to consider at times when they normally would not be using it to review their content in a way that's meaningful for them, or to reorganize their content. There's just some way that continues to bring your product to top of mind at a time when the product would otherwise be fallible.
It's actually, I was trying to think about where does habit fit in all of this? Like your example of Google, right? You know, oh, Bing is, you know, however, two letters shorter, but I have muscle memory that like I type Google, or you know, the stickiness of my browser is default set to Google. The same with
No matter how much
terminology of
Microsoft
toolkit.
tries to change that.
Well, yeah, what? What's
No
that?
matter how much Microsoft tries to change.
Yeah, exactly. It's like there's a mental habit, and so when it comes to your example of like a tool, well, that tool is not really a habit, that's just a when I need it kind of thing,
Right.
as opposed to the enterprise storage case, which is, no, we're not putting in a file server, we're not putting in a file share, we're not putting in network attached storage, we're just gonna put them there, and it's not, oh, it's a tool I use to share files once in a while, it's like, that's just where we put files in general. I use it every day because we don't have any other place. Like my last company, the way we ran, we didn't have anything in-house. If I got hit by a bus, I could be happy that I know everyone would bow their heads and say, oh, that's a damn shame, and then get back to work because nothing would have been lost. Right? You know? That was a habit that was inescapable which would be different from Dropbox, which once
When
in a while.
product becomes a verb, Google, Xerox, product became a verb, and then it meaning, or Uber even, how often will we say, I will Uber it there, even though I may mean Lyft, but I have to say, I will Uber it there, or I Google search, or
Yeah.
let me get a Xerox copy, as opposed to a photocopy. So Dropbox couldn't quite get it.
Nobody said all Dropboxes.
They did.
Maybe for a while.
So this is my start with the biggest red circle on it. But so in conclusion, like, can you win on product? Like, people have, but it's rare. So I think the question is like, why is it so rare? And my best answer is that it's hard to build a culture that creates a superior product. Like, there's this quote that says, "Culture is strategy for breakfast," supposedly from Peter Drucker. And like most quotes I researched, it turns out to be misattributed to him. This guy, Mark Fields at Ford Motor Company, probably said it. But you know, I've thought about this a little bit more deeply as well. And my conclusion here is that like, a lot of the things that make a really superior product don't actually fit well into how businesses typically think about what they should do and not do. Right? Because we tend to think about every decision we make should have a positive return. And I think the really great products have a whole bunch of things that go together that drive the value. If you look at them, any of them individually, you might not be able to justify. You might not be able to justify them. And what's interesting is a lot of the times they're hard to prove in hindsight. Like, we can look back at some of these products, like look at the Drew Houston slide deck, he'll talk about how hard it was to get the sync indicator to work properly in Dropbox, right? And that was one of the things that made it a really smooth thing. But even in hindsight, you can say, well, they did this differently than their competition, but is that what really made it, like, beat out that competition? There's another example I'm really fond of, and it comes from the original iMac. And so we gotta like think way back. This is like the one that Steve Jobs did, like right, first thing he did when he came back to Apple. And it's that bondy blue translucent shell iMac. And that case on the iMac had two features that made it really expensive to manufacture. One, it was translucent plastic, and two, there was a handle on top of the case. And so that case cost $60 to manufacture. And so on a product that costs around $1,000, it's a pretty expensive case, and the average computer case is $20 to manufacture. So you're losing 4 points of margin. And Jonathan Ive says, at the old Apple, I never would have been able to convince essentially the bean counters that this was a good decision. And he says, well, I showed it to Steve, the handle, and he immediately got it. Like, the time people were still kind of uncomfortable with computers, and the main thing the handle did in his mind was give you dominion over the computer. Now, how do you convince?
That's pretty good.
How do you convince your CFO that he wants to give up 4 points of his margin to give his customers dominion over the computer, which is an intangible concept, right? But the interesting about this, even in hindsight, how do you prove that's what made that product successful? It was an incredibly important product to Apple, right? Because they were hemorrhaging money, and it's that first product so you didn't turn the whole company around. But what if they had put a less good case on? How can I even prove that today? And just the case alone, it's not enough, right? It's not like if it had been like every other computer but had a really cool case, it would have been the success it was. And so, so my answer is to part of the reason why it's so rare that you can build a better product. You do have to make this whole set of decisions that it's very difficult to convince people are worth doing. Because there are cheaper, easier decisions that have better short-run return than building a really fantastic product. So the last strategy topic I want to talk about is disruption. And so disruption is another one of these terms that I think, even worse than strategy, it gets turned into this buzzword that people are going to go around and go, I'm going to disrupt my competition by lowering my prices. Or this new feature is going to disrupt the competition. And usually what they mean is the competition cannot sit in their chair and do nothing, right? But a real disruption is not they have to come up with some really obvious response, maybe lowering their prices too. Right? And so I like this definition here that says, disruptive innovation creates a new market by applying a different set of values which ultimately and unexpectedly overtakes the existing market. And the unexpectedly part's really important here. This is why disruptive innovations deep-seat incumbents with tons of resources. And my way to tell if something is really a disruption is to say it can only be disruption if it's worse in some way. Right? So on some important performance attribute of the product, it needs to be worse. Because if it's better all around, you come up with something that is faster, better, cheaper, everyone can recognize that, everyone in the industry will adopt it. Disruptive innovations cause incumbents so much trouble because they can't see them coming. And not only they can't see them coming, is they don't think they're valuable. So one big example of this is hard disk drives, right? It's a little bit dated, we all use flash drives now, but there's this really amazing history of this, going back all the way to mainframe computers. So mainframe computers have these 14-inch disk drives in them. And there's a whole set of companies that build them. And when mini computers come along, you get 8-inch disk drives. But what's really interesting is the companies that were the successful companies in the 14-inch market are not the ones that are successful companies in the 8-inch market. And then this happens again when people go to PCs, right? There's a whole new set of companies that are the successful ones in that market. And even as the PC drives get smaller, this keeps repeating. So why does this happen, right? It's not like a company that produces a 14-inch disk drive cannot figure out how to produce an 8-inch one, right? It's basically the same technology. And in some cases, the 8-inch disk drive was first produced by engineers at a company that was really successful making 14-inch disk drives. And so the reason that these companies cannot see this coming, right? It's not that they don't know there's some people asking for 8-inch disk drive, but what do you do when some new idea comes along? Or as everyone say, well, let's go validate it with our customers, right? Let's go see if they want this.
Let's go kill it in the field.
And who do you intend to go to? Existing customers, and usually the ones that spend the most money with you. They really like your existing product. And so with the disk drive, when you make a disk drive physically smaller, the storage capacity goes down and it's slower. And you go to your best customer who really loved your 14-inch disk drive, and you go, hey, we can make this 8-inch disk drive for you, but it's going to be slower and have less capacity. Would you buy that? And they're like, no, I want more capacity and faster. So you conclude it's a dumb idea. Our customers told us it was a really bad idea. No one wants to buy it, so of course we're not going to do it. And it was amazing what the cycle is. It happens over and over again. And so Clayton Christensen, who wrote like the seminal work on disruptive innovation, he's also a Harvard Business School professor, really strong in strategy. Right? In his book, he goes through this, and it's kind of amazing when you read it that it happens over and over again. And then what's so fascinating at the later stages of it, right? When you get down to 2.5-inch disk drives, right? And then like 1.8 ones come along the market. Like some of these CEOs have sort of figured out that this happened before, and so they said, no, you have to build a 1.8-inch disk drive. But the amazing part is, even the CEO knows like, this is eventually going to be a problem for us. The rest of the organization, all the incentives are still around. Okay, I gotta get more revenue now. Like they don't put any effort into marketing it, right? Everyone's incentives say, I've got to keep, just incrementally innovating on the thing the customers buy. And so another great example of this is BlackBerry. So I used to have a BlackBerry, and the BlackBerry I had 10 years ago is still the best email experience I've ever had on a mobile phone. You could type on that keyboard, the whole thing was like super well optimized to send email. iPhone, it's gotten a little bit better, it's gotten better over time, but still just for email is not as good. And this is what ends up killing BlackBerry, right? Because they're this company that's worth this immense amount of money, billions of dollars in sales, and it's not like they didn't know the iPhone had come along, right? When the iPhone gets launched, there's a ton of hype about it. Like I still remember like watching like Stephen Colbert, like after the iPhone was announced, where he's talking about how it's the God phone and how Steve Jobs has to send one before everyone else, right? There's a ton of hype, but why doesn't BlackBerry respond to this? Because they do the same thing that disk drive companies do, right? They go, well, okay, there's this touch interface. Let's go ask our customers if they want it. And the customers say, no, we really like that you're good at email. And in fact, the iPhone thing, we don't even know how we would use it. There's no enterprise management. It's not secure. All these other things. They convince BlackBerry, it's the iPhone. Yeah, maybe it's like some like nice consumer product, but our enterprise customers won't want it, right? And this is what made touch interfaces disruptive. They were worse for what BlackBerry considered their key value. And so they respond really slowly. And eventually they realize that like the touch devices are taking over their entire market, right? And when they finally figured this out, right, it's too late for them. Because like another strategic principle kicks in, right? Platforms always have this network effect. All the applications, all the apps are on iOS and Android, and so they can't recover from this. So the Bible on disruption is Clayton Christensen's book. It's one of the best strategy books I've read. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it, because it really goes into depth in this area of strategy, and he does a great job explaining it. So in summary, the biggest threat to any strategy you come up with is your competitors' war. We want to create differentiated, unique, added value, because that's really the only way we can get superior returns for our business. Our product has to be better in a way that customers value more. We talked about 3 sources of competitive advantage: the cost advantage, network effect, differentiation, and how disruptive innovation destroys deep-seated competitive advantages. So if you are lucky enough to be an incumbent in a market with great advantages, this is what you have to watch out for putting into them. So my slides are up on SlideShare, but any questions?
I keep thinking back to the Lego story, how this fits in. They start off as a wooden toy company, and at some point someone said, hey, well, I like the toys, but there's no system in it. And then they went off and said, oh, these plastic bricks, maybe we should make more of them. Maybe we should make them interlocking or something like that. And of course, this blew up. It's almost a network effect. But I'm curious how you see that strategy.
I guess there's some network effect there, because if you wanted to use your friends' Legos, they would work together with your Legos. But I don't know if it's really that strong, because if it's something people do a lot. I mean, I think the interesting thing about them in the later time period, right, is back when I was a kid, they sold you like big piles of blocks of Legos, right? And then at one point, like people were buying less Legos, it just wasn't an interesting toy, right? And now they've become a much more profitable business, because what do they sell you? They sell you kits to make specific things. And so I don't know, like from a business strategy point of view, it's a great example of any of these principles. I think it's like super interesting from like a product strategy point of view, right? That selling people this kit you could make a bunch of things out of, but you got to figure it out, versus this thing that'll make something really cool that you like, right? So the kit that makes something really cool that people can like visualize, right, is a lot better from a like product point of view.
I think you might actually see a reverse trend. So I've got a 7-year-old daughter, and what I thought was really interesting is, the kids are all playing Minecraft. My daughter has a ton of Lego, and I actually, have tried to figure out why is it she spends more time playing with Minecraft, building things in Minecraft, for which there are no instructions, remember, versus the Lego and the kits. And I actually wonder if some of it is they've gone past the point of pendulum where now it's like, no, you don't get to build what you want. This is the kit, this is the thing. And they've actually undermined what was the original attraction, which was it was a creative building toy. And so now, we think of it in terms of physicality. Legos, you get to build stuff in physical. But perhaps now the dimension is, well, you're building this thing we tell you to build, and they're missing out on you can choose what to build, and Minecraft is filling that in some way. And again, a new dimension that we didn't value before. Why would kids want to play with things in a virtual world that they can never touch? Well, most of their life is digital. Maybe they care more about it.
Well, the other thing that we mentioned that I thought of is that, like with Legos, you were always limited what you could build by how many bricks you have, right? In the virtual world, you can just keep building. You don't have to get your parents to go to the store and buy you more bricks to make something bigger.
That's true. That's true.
There is also an aspect of who the buyer is. Today, Legos is bought as gifts, or parents buy it. I don't know that the demand for that really comes from the player.
From the kid.
From the kid, yes. So you want that finished aircraft, ship, whatever it is, that achievement.
No, you want to feel like a good parent.
You want.
And buying, access to Minecraft, that's not a good parent. You're putting them in front of a screen.
Exactly.
I don't know.
So, using either your current employer or previous employer as an example, how do you put these concepts into practical use as a product manager?
So I think the thing that I think about the most, right, is what can I do to my product to make it better that the competitor has a hard time copying, right? So the product I work on today, I work in ad tech, as I mentioned, and I work on in that what we call header bidding area. This is how publishers send inventory. And the company I work for did a really smart thing. I can't take credit for it because they did it before I got there. But they switched the core of the product from sort of proprietary code base to the open source one. And our biggest competitor uses proprietary code base. And so what advantage does the open source give me that the competitor has a hard time matching? Well, I can work with more partners with much lower work. It costs me to integrate them. So I can expand out that way into other channels. The open source platform supports, I can expand out that way. But it's something that's hard for them to match, right? And since I'm thinking about what value can I add that's going to be very hard for them to copy, right? I'm looking for things like that where I can either already have some advantage I can exploit, or like what advantages there can I create?
But you have to have some sort of business model, right? So by making open source tool, you have to have some sort of monetization strategy, probably, right?
Yeah. So in the market I work in, because I work for an ad exchange, right? Like essentially the key thing that we want is for publishers to keep sending their inventory to us. And having a product in the space I work in is helpful for that. So it kind of got this built-in monetization out of it. The open source product is there because there's other vendors in the space, some of the other big players said, this proprietary approach isn't, we don't think it's good either, so we're going to open source the thing that we built, right? And we're going to get some other players on board, like the company I work for. So, and then we're all monetizing primarily through like that core ad exchange business.
Back when you were talking about Uber and you talked about what their competitive landscape, et cetera, is, what the competitive alternative is, it's kind of an interesting story. Just the last couple of days, they dumped a bunch of money into Lime, the scooter company. So they've started to recognize, oh, wait a minute, that's an alternative transportation thing. We need to make a play in that area.
Yeah, because it's a substitute for Uber, right?
Exactly.
If you're going short distance in the city, well, I could call an Uber, I could take one of these scooter things.
So they put some money into that.
It's the 8-inch disc drive of transport.
Yep.
Kind of interesting thinking about some of your comments about differentiation and is it sustainable? And I've seen in some markets, like in software websites, it's like, oh, well, they changed it to blue, we can change to blue like in less than an hour turnaround time. In some of the kind of more physical hardware markets where the design life cycle is, say, a year out, I've seen some interesting fails on the part of companies where the lead competitor has introduced, handles on their hardware. And then what happens, the knee-jerk reaction is if you're at the competition and you lose the first couple of big sales deals because you don't have handles, the sales executive then screams, we need handles, and that becomes your roadmap. And then you add handles a year later to your product, at which point they've got handles inside your mirrors, and your roadmap becomes following your competitor a year later with discounted pricing, which then sinks you completely, as opposed to saying, yes, they have that, but we've got a different differentiator and not following in the competitor's wake. But it's really a difficult argument to make when the sales guy is foaming at the mouth that he's not going to get his new coat paid for. So just an observation.
No, I think that's a great observation, right? Because any of us who work in like any enterprise area, right? The sales guys are always foaming at the mouth of the last deal they lost, right? Because of the feature you didn't have, right? And I've only heard 2 explanations ever in my career for why the sales guy lost the deal, right? One was product was inferior, didn't have some feature they had to have, or the price is too high. Right? I'm still waiting for the loss report that says we lost due to bad sales execution. I will fall out of my chair if I ever see that.
That guy got fired before he could write it.
He'd be my hero, because I'd be like, at least, it's not one of the generic 2 reasons. Right, and I've certainly been in a situation too where you end up sort of behind the 8 ball where your competitors are, like you've got some functional deficiency versus them, right? And you're trying to catch up and they go ahead, right? And so if we think about like strategic point of view, right? If you're just trying to catch up to them, you're never different and better. So it's impossible for you to get a superior return over them. And hardware, I think, is probably extra difficult, right? Because software, like you can go try to beg for, extra developers and, try to get ahead somewhere. I think hardware, you've got these cycles that are very hard to compress, right? And so, then I think you're trying to figure out, okay, like what is the thing? I don't do the handles and what the size of mirrors are, but is there something else I can do that will give me a bit of an edge, right? And to me, that often comes down to like understanding what your customers need rather than just following the competition.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the quote you have said about culture eating strategy for breakfast. It's just I keep thinking about it. So for the last 2 years, I've been working in bigger, more traditional organizations, right? Tech companies, but more established ones. However, I've been on emerging technology teams. conversation when I connected car, this sort of stuff. And my question is, which techniques or approaches would you recommend for advancing strategies for newer tech or newer, more novel products in the company where culture is based on the more traditional products and more traditional business practices?
Oh, so I get a lot of comments here on this.
New building far away.
Yeah. Well, actually, I've done that one too.
They did create new processes.
I spent almost 3 years working in innovation group where we did have a separate building. It was actually a really nice building. It was in Redondo Beach. It actually overlooked the pier. It was beautiful.
Tell me more about this.
Well, it's gone now, but so I can tell you a lot about the challenges of this, right? That I think one of the reasons, like, emerging technologies are always really hard for established businesses, right? Is that if we think of, like, when I was doing this, I was like building products that were, like first generation products in this innovation group, right? I would always think about what would this be if it was an independent startup? Like what round would I be raising? Like how many employees would I have, and benchmark it like that? And I realized when I started thinking about it that way, right? Like generally these companies go the seed round, the A round, B round, C round. These rounds start getting really large, right? Even if you've got a really great business, right, you got to spend so much money to like build that out. That and venture capitalists are used to this, right? They want you to build $1 billion business, and you go burn their $60 million round, but really expand your customer base. They're super happy. They're like, okay, here's the D round, here's more money, right? But existing businesses don't like to do this, right? That's comes straight off of the profit number. So I found that to be one challenge. Like typically, like if you look at what existing businesses find the easiest to do is something that sits really well with the existing business, right? So in terms of all the functions out there, like how do I sell it, how do I service it, and like one of my favorite examples here, right, is that we all know the legend about how Xerox cards invented the future, right? They invented the mouse, like graphical user interfaces, Ethernet, right? All these things that turn into like these billion-dollar businesses, right? People actually don't talk enough about the one they actually successfully commercialized, because it's really instructive to around this problem, right? So what is the one that they commercialized? Laser printer. They made a lot of money on that. Why did how did they miss that the graphical computing interfaces were great, but like the laser printer is like they did that one? It's because they fit really well. Like they understood it, right? We take this machine, you put it in paper, something comes out, something with ink comes out the other end. Like it's a lot like a copier. Like all the activities in their company align really well to that. Like if you have somebody who can already service a copier, you can teach them probably in a day how to service a laser printer. It's got a couple different parts, but it's like most of the problems are the same. Like there's something messed up in the paper handling path, like how you sell it. And so I haven't seen a huge number of good examples about like how you get them to do a different business. Like one of the challenges is like how much money it takes to build that business, right? And the other problem I found is that like the mindset of public companies is I want like a ton of revenue now, right? And like even the best businesses, right? Like you can get your favorite startups that turn into these multi-billion-dollar empires. They can like start making turning out $5 million in 2 years. And the conclusion I came when I thought about all this is like this is why they're venture capitalists, right? Because they understand all these problems. There's lots of things you can like say that is not great about the venture model, right? They'd rather gamble than like they don't really care about small return. There's one a big one, but they're set up to deal with these problems that are hard to deal with existing businesses. So I wish I had a better answer for you. On my blog, I do have like a longer blog post that kind of came out of my like 3 years of doing this, but.
I wanted to mention that So I had to experience this thing twice in a big way. One was, and both when I used to work for a company called Hewlett Packard, and they had this huge laserjet printer business, and this kind of these inkjet technology. Everybody wanted to kill it in the company, and one of the things we had to do is to do it a totally different facility, totally have a complete firewall and
Yep.
That's one of the ideas. Other idea again, same thing at HP. You have this big, mainframe HP 3000 and all these big businesses, and here come this PC-based, kind of horizontally segmented business model, right? And again, there are a lot of disruptive things. It again comes back to the disruption and how you survive in that thing. I think that going into a startup or kind of completely splitting off that as a separate spin-off and variety of different ways to.
Yeah, and so like Cutting Persons talks about spinning it off. I think it's a good thing. I think there's a whole bunch of challenges even after you do that. And interestingly, in Innovators Lumber, he does talk about the success HP had with inkjets by doing that.
You might actually, just to close on that, because it's really, some of it is to where is the future for these kinds of organizations? Back to culture eating strategy.
Culture eating strategy.
Right. So there's one of the Mind the Product talks last year. Janice Fraser, she used to be at Adaptive Path. She talked about the challenge for a lot of these emerging products groups or these innovation groups within companies are they go off, they do all the design thinking, and ultimately the org is like, yeah, that's great. That's really, we're just going to put that, the Internet of Things, you say. Well, we'll just put that on the shelf. Thank you so much. When we need one of those, we'll go and look at it. And so she talked actually about sort of this new mindset that needed to be built into companies from the beginning, which is, yeah, that's great. Now, I'll use Amazon example. That's great. You sell books. Fantastic. But, you're not going to sell books forever. Right? You got any other things that you're good at along the way? And to your point of, it's a continuation of some part of what you know already. Hey, here's AWS, right? That you built all this expertise and now you can go. But that requires the organization to be willing to sort of say, yeah, we're not going to sell books forever. Or that's not what we're about, per se. And so her talk is really great. If you go find it on Mind the Product, Janice Fraser was a good one.
I'll say Amazon has a unique tolerance for low profits.
And that's a cultural attribute, right?
Yeah.
The Bezos' thing is you need to have a willingness to be misunderstood for very long periods of time. And that is absolutely ingrained within the organization.
Yeah.
Cool, well give it up for Mike Chowla. That was wonderful.